So beast fighting against the church, able to overcome them briefly at the end of church history, but not permanently, because they rise from the dead and are ascended into heaven in the rapture eventually. The beast becomes the object of worship to everybody in the world, except those who worship Christ. And that's what we read in verse 8. All who dwell on the earth will worship him whose names have not been written in the book of life of the Lamb slain from the foundation of the world. If you have not been if you're not a follower of Christ, in other words, if you're not in his book of life, if you're not worshiping Jesus, you're worshiping the state, whether you know it or not. Now, most people in modern times don't bow down to images of the state like they did in Roman times, but people do still have their loyalty primarily to the state. I mean, patriotism is the religion of people who have no other religion. How do I know that? Because they will die for the state. Many people would never die for Jesus, but they die for the country. In fact, it's considered to be heroic. In fact, even the churches are very proud of people who go out and fight and die for the country. And perhaps they'd be just as happy with someone who goes out and fights and dies on the mission field. But it's interesting that we all make heroes of people who go and fight for the country. And the country is what? The country is the state. Now, of course, the country is us, the citizens too, and that's why we're so happy that there's some people out there defending us. No wonder. I mean, we can't really be blamed for being happy that there's someone out defending us from bad people. The Bible says God has ordained the state to do that. But in Revelation, the state that God has ordained becomes an object of worship and a tool of Satan in competition with Christ. And we see this, for example, by the fact that ultimately people are given a number on their forehead or their hand, which is mimicking the Roman practice, which can be well established. I heard preachers say this for years before I looked it up to make sure it was right. I got tired of trusting preachers when they told me, well, in the Roman days they did this or that. You know, I think, well, maybe they did, maybe they didn't. I'm going to check that out, you know. I've learned not to trust preachers. And I would encourage you not to trust them either. You can do your own research about this. I did that. I looked it up. You can find plenty of verification of this on the internet from historical, secular things about the Roman Empire. In the Roman Empire, a slave who ran away and was captured again and was returned to his master would be branded on his forehead or on his hand with like the owner's brand or name, like cattle are branded. The forehead and the hand were particularly the parts of the body of choice because they're the parts least likely to be concealed in public. The hand is rarely covered in public, and the forehead likewise. Therefore, at a glance, these people could be identified as slaves, and of whose slave they were, by the brand upon them. That's the imagery used here. The beast, his servants, his slaves, as it were, bear his brand on their head and on their hand. And that is in contrast with, if you look at chapter 14, verse 1. Chapter 14, verse 1 says, Then I looked, and behold, a lamb standing on Mount Zion, and with him 144,000, having his father's name written on their foreheads. These ones were sealed. They received the seal of God on their forehead back in chapter 7. And now it's said to be the name of their father. The name of the Lamb's father is on their forehead. So you've got, all people have somebody's name on. You've got to serve somebody. It may be the devil or it may be the Lord, but you've got to serve somebody. You're somebody's slave. You either have the devil's brand on you or you've got God's brand on you because you're somebody's servant. Now, this is figurative, of course, because Christians don't literally have tattoos on their heads or computer chips under the skin or anything like that have the Father's name on them. Although people try to make this some kind of a modern technological thing, you probably have heard people say that the Bible teaches there's going to be a one-world monetary system without money, going to be a cashless society. That's been said as long as there's been dispensationalists, I suppose. Where do they get that? Well, those who don't have the mark of the beast, we're told, cannot buy or sell. And that's the whole case for a cashless society that's ever found in the Bible. those who do not take the mark of the beast cannot buy or sell. Now, futurists often, dispensationalists usually, believe that this mark of the beast is literally something put on your body which is used for business transactions, for purchases and such. And it replaces cash. When I was a teenager, the prophecy teacher said it's a laser tattoo. It'll be a credit number laser tattooed onto your hand or forehead, so when you go to a store, instead of using money or even a credit card, you just scan your hand under the black light and it'll debit your account. So it's just like using a credit card, but it's built in. Well, in those days, laser tattoos were high tech. Nowadays, nobody talks about laser tattoos or black lights. That was hippie stuff, black lights. But nowadays, we got sexier technology. We've got computer chips that can be put under the skin or on the forehead. And so every few days, I receive someone forwarding me something in the email about how this is being planned already. There's this RFD, is it RFD they call it? Chips that are radio frequency something or another. Anyway, these chips, they say it's got to go into your hand or your forehead because that's the best place for something, recharging the battery or something like that. And that, they're going to use that. How they're going to use a chip, it's not entirely clear. I guess scanning. And they always give examples of how, there's this company in Florida that is already giving such chips to animals, pets, and so forth, because it helps you to locate them. And they're going to put all our medical records on a chip and put it on us, and this is the mark of the beast. Well, so far, I don't see any comparisons between that and the mark of the beast, except the claim that it'll be on the hand or the forehead. And the mark of the beast is not about your medical records. The mark of the beast is not about locating you when you get lost. The mark of the beast is not even necessarily about purchasing things with a credit number. It is true that those who don't have the mark of the beast cannot buy or sell, but it does not mean because they need that mark for the transactions to go through the bank. It can easily mean that they cannot buy or sell. That's a specimen of persecution, that they are, if they don't conform to the world and to the beast, people will persecute them, ostracize them, boycott them, and this has happened many times in the world. Many times in especially oppressive states, which were anti-Christian, there were actually laws made against doing business with Christians, selling or buying from them. Actually, the popes put out some papal bulls in the Middle Ages against the Waldensians. The Waldensians were evangelical Christians who didn't go along with the popes. And there were actual papal bulls that forbade people to buy or sell anything with them. It's a form of persecution. It's a form of boycott. Now, some might say, but why would that particular thing be mentioned if it's not about, cashlessness? Well, several times people who die for the Lord are referred to in Revelation. They're always referred to as having been beheaded. And yet not all people who die for the Lord are beheaded. A lot of people were beheaded by the Romans, the Christians who were killed by the Romans. Some of them were beheaded, some were fed to lions, some were killed other ways. But they're always the ones beheaded for the gospel. This is simply shorthand for saying martyred. It's like taking one example of how people are martyred and having it stand for all kinds of martyrdom. Anyone who's beheaded for Christ is, has certain things said about them. Well, what about the person who was stabbed or burned or fed to lions? What, he doesn't get the same privilege as someone beheaded? Obviously, that's nonsense. The ones who are beheaded simply stand for people who are martyred. The ones who are persecuted by boycott simply stand for the larger category of general ostracism and boycott and persecution of them as a class because they don't conform to what the rest of the world is agreeing to, namely the mark of the beast. But what is the mark of the beast then? Well, it's on the hand and the forehead. What does that tell us? Well, if you look at Deuteronomy chapter 6, Deuteronomy 6, it says in verse 6 and following through verse 9, "And these words which I command you today shall be in your heart. You shall teach them diligently to your children, and shall talk of them when you sit in your house, when you walk by the way, when you lie down, and when you rise up. You shall bind them as a sign on your hand, and they shall be as frontlets between your eyes. You shall write them on the doorposts of your house and on your gates. Now when it says the law shall be bound to your hands as a sign on your hand, and between your eyes, on your forehead in other words. Jewish people, some Jewish people have taken this quite literally. They've made what they call phylacteries, a little leather box or pouch, and they put little scroll pieces, little scriptures written on paper or parchment, and they put them in these little pouches and they bind them with strings around their head. They have maybe you've seen this in pictures of Israeli Jews. Some of them have the phylacteries like a cylindrical little thing coming out from the front of their head and a strap around it. They're binding the law to their forehead between their eyes. They have scraps of the law there. They do it on their hands too. That's what phylacteries are. But I don't believe that this is what God had in mind. That's rather a wooden literalism. Bind the law to your hands as a sign and between your eyes. I think it's more reasonable to assume that what he's saying is, I want your hands and your full attention to be on my law. I want your hands govern your works. Your hands are your works. Your between your eyes where you'll see it's on your thoughts. That your thoughts and your actions, your thoughts and your works will be governed by my laws. And that'll be a sign to people when they see you acting and thinking like me, like God. When you see that my words and my revelation of my law are governing the way you think and the way you act, that will be a sign to people. And I believe that when the beast's mark is on the hand or the forehead, it has a similar meaning. These people think and act like the beast. Christians don't. They think like their father. They have their father's name on their forehead. And just as a brand of a master on a slave's forehead would immediately give away whose slave he was, so the behavior and thoughts of Christians should give away immediately whose servant they are. And likewise, those who serve the beast, their thoughts and their actions differ significantly from those of the believers, and that gives them away too. In other words, when people see how you act and how you think, they should know instantly whose servant you are. If you look at Romans chapter 6, in verse 15, Paul asks this question, then answers it. Romans 6:15, he says, "What then? Shall we sin because we're not under the law but under grace? Certainly not." He says, "Do you not know that to whom you present yourselves slaves to obey, you are that one's slaves, whom you obey, whether of sin to death or of obedience to righteousness?" And he says, you're either obeying sin or you're obeying righteousness. And whoever you're obeying is your master. Whoever you yield yourself to, that's the person, you're that servant of that person. Anyone can tell whose servant you are. What do you mean, can we sin because we're under grace? Are you under grace or are you under sin? Who are you serving? Are your actions sinful? Then you're serving sin. You're not under grace, you're under sin. You're a slave of sin. You can tell by who you're obeying who's your master, he says. And so also in this picturesque way, using imagery which I think the Roman world would understand, perhaps more intuitively than we would, Revelation is saying there are two kinds of people in the world. There are those who are the servants of God. These have God's name on their forehead. And then there are those who are the servants of the system, the satanic system. Their loyalty is to the beast. Now we're later going to find that the woman, who I would identify with Jerusalem, most people do not, but I think the woman who's the harlot is Jerusalem, is riding on the beast. Now you might think, well, the Romans and the Jews, they didn't have a cozy relationship. They hated each other. Well, that may be true. But when it came to choosing between Jesus and the Romans, the Jews of his time said, we have no king but Caesar. Pilate said, what, shall I crucify your king? This is the king of the Jews. They said, we don't have any king except Caesar. He's our king. Well, they hated Caesar just as much as they hated Jesus, but, well, maybe not quite as much. They'd rather avow Caesar as their king than Jesus. And this is the Jews who hated Caesar. So, I mean, when it comes down to it, you have to serve somebody. You're going to have someone who's going to be your king. Your ultimate loyalty is going to be to one party or another. And it's either Jesus or it's going to be really pretty much the state in all likelihood. And so people, their behavior, their thoughts are like a mark. It's like a giveaway whose servant they are. Like a servant with a mark on his forehead walking through the streets of Rome. At a glance, people could see who his master was. It's like it's advertised all over his face. It's written all over his face and his hands. And so also who your master is written all over your face and your hands. That is, it's written in the way, the thoughts you express and the way you behave. And I believe that this is the contrast that we see at the end of chapter 13 and the beginning of 14. Now, what about that second beast? We'll just quickly talk about the second beast. There is a contrast, of course, between the first beast and the second. And as I said, the second beast is later referred to as the false prophet. Now, a prophet is a religious person, a religious spokesman. There were true prophets, obviously, both in the Old and New Testament, and there are today. But there were also false prophets, the prophets of Baal. There were prophets of all the false gods. And there were people who were falsely prophets of Yahweh. They claimed they spoke in the name of Yahweh, but they weren't really, he hadn't sent them, and they ran without being authorized. They were false prophets. Now, the Old Testament never uses the expression false prophet. It just uses the word prophet. But you often read about prophets in the Old Testament that are indeed false. They just don't call them false prophets. They say a prophet came and said this, or a prophet of Baal, or a prophet of the gods, or other gods. We can tell they're false by the fact that they're lying, or that they represent the wrong God, but they're simply called prophets. And then there's prophets of Yahweh that speak the truth. But they're religious. They're religious leaders. But in the Old Testament, all nations had their national gods. And therefore the kings always had prophets on their staff. Prophets and kings were basically working together. There was a state religion. And to be loyal to the king required being loyal to the king's God as well, the king's religion. That's why Jezebel, when she made Baal worship the official religion of Israel, she went out and killed all the prophets that she could find of Yahweh. It was illegal not to worship Baal. Now, the priests and the prophets of the state religion enforce it. And I believe that just as the first beast represents political power, manifested whenever and wherever it may be, when Satan is energizing it, Satan is using it, inspiring it. Although God ordained governments to do the right thing, governments almost invariably, unless something holds them back, like a conscience, they invariably become agents of Satan and do satanic things. Now, you don't very often find a government with a conscience, so more often than not, God's minister becomes Satan's minister, and eventually begins to persecute Christians and other people who are dissenters to the status quo. But not only is there the state power, which is the sword, there is the state religion. That is, religious loyalty is a factor too. I believe that the second beast represents false religion wedded to the state, which gives the state, as it were, its divine right to rule in the sight of the people. Now, I said that in Romans chapter 12, Paul did say that the state is ordained by God, but that doesn't mean the state has a divine right to do whatever it wants to do. And that's what states usually, commandeer to themselves. Put a man in power, and if there isn't something like a constitution preventing it, he's going to become an absolute autocrat. Why? Because he can. Because he can. He controls the armies. You know, if one of the generals comes up and kills him and takes his place, whoever controls the armies can be the boss. And so the state's power is one of force. But some states actually have the hearts of their people on their side. They don't have to force them with the sword because the people are inclined to worship them. Inclined to think their country is the greatest country. Think of how it was with Hitler's youth and the Third Reich. How many people in Germany thought the German state is God's chosen people. And, to advance the cause of the German race and the German state and the German Führer was worth killing off Jews, gypsies, Christians, whatever gets in the way. Whatever the Führer says is bad, we've got to get rid of those people. And it was like a religious fervor for the Führer. So also most governments, certainly pagan governments, have had state religions, cults of the emperor. Many of the emperors required that people worship them, and they had, the priests of their countries requiring people to worship them. And so this second beast, it has two horns like a lamb, which of course the lamb in Revelation being Christ suggests that this beast mimics or is a counterfeit for Christ or for Christianity. Christ is the one that is followed by those who are the true followers. That's what it says in chapter 14 about the 144,000. In verse 4 it says they follow the Lamb wherever he goes. But this guy looks a little like a lamb too. He's got horns like a lamb, but when he speaks he doesn't sound like a lamb, he sounds like a dragon, sounds like the devil. Reminds me of the Aesop's fable where a donkey found a lion's skin. And somehow he managed to put the lion's skin on top of himself and walk around, and got a lot of respect that donkeys don't usually get, because at first glance everyone thought he was a lion. And all the creatures that used to mock him as a donkey now were giving him a wide berth and deferring to him and treating him like a king. He's feeling pretty good. He's feeling his oats, you might say. He decided to let out a roar of triumph. But as soon as he did, he sounded like a donkey again, and everyone knew that he wasn't a lion. He looked like a lion, but he talked like a donkey, because inside that's what he really was. He had a costume on. Jesus said, beware of false prophets. Why? He says, they have sheep's clothing on, but inwardly they are ravening wolves. This false prophet has sheep's horns on. He's dressed up like a sheep. He's got lamb's horns on him, but inside he's a ravening wolf, or more like a dragon. When he speaks, it makes it clear what's really in there. And you can discern by what they say. Moses gave a test in Deuteronomy 13 how to know a false prophet. And it was interesting because it corresponds so much to this particular false prophet. That is, if people would follow Deuteronomy 13, they would never be deceived by this particular false prophet in Revelation 13, because Deuteronomy 13 says, if there arises among you a prophet or a dreamer of dreams, and he gives you a sign or a wonder. Now, we haven't dwelt on it yet, we will, but this false prophet in Revelation 13 gives signs and wonders. He works wonders and miracles in the sight of the first beast, and everyone marvels. Well, here's a false prophet, or a prophet who gives you a sign or a wonder. Deuteronomy 13 verse 2 says, and that sign or wonder comes to pass. So this is it really works. He gives you a sign and it really happens. Okay, looks like he's the real deal, right? Of which he spoke to you, saying, let us go after other gods, which you have not known, and let us serve them. Oh, he's speaking like a dragon. He calls himself a prophet. He does signs and wonders, such as a real prophet might be able to do, but when he talks, something else comes out. He's saying, let's go worship other gods, not Yahweh. And we're told in verse 3, you shall not listen to the words of that prophet or that dreamer of dreams, for the Lord your God is testing you to know whether you love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul. So false religion often has many things about it that resemble true, real faith, real Christianity, real religion, the real worship of God. Sometimes religions seem to have divine power associated with them. There are miracles worked in Hinduism and in Buddhism and in voodoo and in many other false religions. I say miracles, it could be magic, it could be, it's something supernatural. It's demonic. But the point is, it impresses the people who can't explain the supernatural any other way than it must be God or the gods or something. And they don't realize it could be demons. These beasts are more acting in the power of Satan. And it says of this of this particular second beast, in Revelation 13:13, he performs great signs so that he even makes fire come down from heaven on the earth in the sight of men. That's what the two witnesses were able to do. So he's mimicking the supernatural power of the church. And then we have this. And he deceives those who dwell on the earth by those signs which he was granted to do in the sight of the beast, telling those who dwell on the earth to make an image to the beast, who was wounded by the sword and lived. And he was granted power to give breath to the image of the beast, that the image of the beast should both speak and cause as many as would not worship the image of the beast to be killed. So one of the signs that he can do is create an image of the beast and give it life, make it seem to have spirit, give a spiritual dimension to the political system, imbue it with a religious, spiritual essence. That being patriotic is the same thing as being spiritual or being, religious in this mindset. Basically, the deification of the state. It says he makes an image of the beast. That means he makes an idol out of the state. Many people have made an idol of the state. They will sacrifice for the state what they will never sacrifice for God or for Christ. They'd sacrifice their children, send them off to war, but they won't send them to the mission field. Making sacrifices for the state you wouldn't make for God suggests that you've made an idol of the state. You put it above God, what is that? But an idol. And then, basically, to enable the state, through the state religion, to enforce worship of the state, as if it gives the image life. We've got to remember, Revelation's got a lot of sensational imagery here that has, spiritual meanings behind it. If you take this literally, then you're a dispensationalist, and you're welcome too. But I personally don't think that taking any of this literally is what is intended. We've got imagery from Daniel, we've got imagery from other parts of the Bible, from Deuteronomy and so forth, and I think that we're supposed to get an idea, not get a picture and say this is a picture of what's going to happen. It's rather a description of how the state has its religious branch, its false religions that cause and encourage devotion to the state, and they make the state into an idol to be worshipped, and almost like a living thing, a living God to be worshipped, giving life, giving breath, giving spirit to the institution, so that people don't think it's incongruous to put the state in the place of God. And so, at any time, and in any place, Satan may be using false religions and their adherence to states that are anti-Christian to help him in his war against the saints. Remember, at the end of chapter 12, the dragon was furious with the woman and went to make war with her. And when chapter 12 ended, the war was going on. In chapter 13, of course, there's no chapter divisions in the original. We have, as he's warring against the woman, he calls up these confederates, the two beasts. Satan uses state power and false religious power in his warfare against the church. The state power is the power of the sword. The religious beast is the power of deception. And these are the two things that the churches had to face from the very beginning: persecution of the sword and heresy. Where we saw that earlier too, when the dragon spewed water out of his mouth in chapter 12 and verse 15. Out of the dragon's mouth comes deception, and a flood of deception, heresies. But the church survives it. But some don't. Some individuals don't. The true church survives. The true church remains faithful to Christ. He's still their king. They say, we must obey God rather than men. You see, the early church, as you may know, when ordered to burn incense as an act of worship to the Caesars, would not do so. And that's why they were fed to the lions. That's why they were burned. They would not deify the state, which everybody else was doing. And everyone could see the Christians were different, and that caused them to be ostracized. They were not, admired for being different. They were feared, held in suspicion. When there were natural disasters, the Roman authorities said it was the Christians that caused it because they had angered the gods by not worshiping the gods. When Rome was burned, almost certainly by Nero himself, he said the Christians did it. The Christians became the brunt and the scapegoat for just about everything that went wrong, and therefore were persecuted, and that has continued to be the case. We have lived in a very unusual time in the past 200 years where a nation was established on the idea of religious liberty, where first of all Christians could not or were not supposed to be able to be persecuted for their faith. Furthermore, it was a country that was very largely influenced by Christian founders and Christian thinkers, so that we have lived in a very charmed bubble in this part of the world. And many other parts of the world have gone the way that America did, following America, but then now they're going back again, and America's going back again too. Maybe we've had our day. Maybe we had our opportunity to sort of be free from the beast for a little while, the only people in history who ever were, and only for a short time. We've gotten spoiled. Now if persecution comes, I've heard people say, if there's not a pre-tribulation rapture, I don't know if I want to be a Christian. You ever heard anyone say that? I've heard people say that more than once. When I say I don't believe in pre-trib rapture, they say, well, I don't want to be a Christian then if there's no pre-trib rapture. My answer is, well, probably you're not a Christian then. Maybe you got your wish. You don't want to be a Christian, you're not. If you won't lay down your life, Jesus said, you aren't his disciple. If you don't come to me and hate your father, mother, wife, children, and your own life also, you can't be my disciple. If you don't take up your cross and follow me, you can't be my disciple. Well, if you're not willing to suffer for Christ, then you're not taking up any cross, you're not hating your life, you're not doing what Jesus said that takes to be a disciple. You're not a disciple. Being a Christian always meant being willing to die for your faith, and for most times in history, in most places, and including many at this time, that's exactly what people know it costs them. They count that cost because where they live, that's what happens, or at least the Christians are in danger of having happen to them. And we have lived in a world, a part of the world, and a part of history that's been very unusual in that respect, that we've actually had some unusual freedoms. You may have heard there's some of those being taken away as we speak. Just a few months ago, a man, a father, homeschooling dad in Arizona, was put in jail for 60 days because he held meetings in his home, Christian meetings. He wasn't bothering anybody else. The meetings were not noisy. He had like several acres, I believe, and people parked on his property, not on the streets. There was nothing about his meetings that interfered with any of his neighbors. And because he was having Christian meetings worshiping God, he was put in jail. That's been in the news a fair bit. And it's just the most recent of many. I've heard of cases like that since the 70s. But the government is not in favor of Jesus, unless you have people in the government who are themselves Christians. That hasn't been the case probably for a very long time in this country. I'm not sure if any of our presidents in the past 2 centuries have been Christians. I don't know. I know John Adams was a Christian. There's a few, if you go way back, I think there are a few Christians in there, and maybe there have been some in modern times I'm not aware of, because I don't know the religious convictions of each of these, but from what I understand, to get into the presidency, you kind of have to make some compromises that Christians usually, if they have consciences, don't do. That's what Chuck Colson said, and he was pretty up there in the Nixon administration. And Colson said you can't really become a president without lying, without compromising. You pretty much have to, be ruthless. You have to not be merciful. You really can't be a very good Christian, he said, and really become a president. It's just the way the system is. So even here, where the persecution is not great, or has not been in recent times, it still isn't a Christian state. And if we think it is, we're just probably trying to lull ourselves to sleep and think it's going to be okay after all. But the beast in Scripture is, I believe, still alive today in different forms. You'll certainly find him if you go to North Korea or China or Cuba or any Muslim country, or probably many other kinds of countries too. And you might even find him here, If not so much now, maybe not too long from now. In any case, he is given power and authority to make war against the saints, and that's what he's doing. He's an arm of Satan's warfare against the church. He's the political arm. There's also a religious arm. And that's what John sees here, I believe. And this then brings us to the end of the portion of Revelation that I would call the little book, which was introduced to us in chapter 10. We will read no more in Revelation about this 3.5 years. It was first mentioned in chapter 11. It continued to be mentioned through chapters 12 and 13. And now that season is apparently done. And when we turn back to chapter 14, in my opinion, we're looking back now at the main theme of the book. We've jumped outside the parenthesis in the middle, back into the main subject matter, which has to do with the judgment of God on apostate Jerusalem in AD 70. And I will, of course, defend that thesis as we come to the proper places next time.